So far this semester, we've kind of been talking about history in Quebec in terms of individual events. And I keep promising that they do sort of fit into a larger narrative, into a larger story. And that's sort of what we're getting into in this video. So we've talked through a number of examples, okay, about how the Francophone population of Canada was sort of mistreated or perceived the likelihood of mistreatment from the rest of Canada, sort of from 1763 forward. When we're talking about the Quebec Act, we're talking about the exclusion from public office, we're talking about being inundated by loyalists, we're talking about conscription, we're talking about ideas about confederation as a containment strategy. All of those things, okay, in a lot of ways contribute to an overall fear of mistreatment in Quebec, of the population who lives in Quebec, by the rest of Canada. And in some ways, this is a fear that still very much exists in Quebec. So if you survey Canadians across the country, people who were born and raised in Quebec are the least likely to have traveled or visited other provinces in Canada. Um, there's, and that is sort of a historical trend in that there's a large portion of the population of Quebec that has never left the province, and there was an even larger one when we go back sort of historically to the 1940s and the 1950s. Okay, so up until 1960, we will talk about what changes around 1960, but for right now, up until 1960, the other thing that you really need to understand is that in Quebec, there is a degree of overlap between the church and the state, specifically the Catholic Church, that most people in Canada today would find disturbing and really, really concerning. So we've sort of talked about this when we talked about government expenditures in health and education, but for a very long time, it was quite common for the government of Quebec, the provincial government of Quebec, to appoint ministers of health and ministers of education who had not been elected at all. And this is a thing that governments can do, it is a possibility. In this case, what the government of Quebec did when they were appointing unelected ministers of health or ministers of education is usually appointing members of the Catholic Church. So they're appointing almost exclusively priests. There's a couple of nuns in that list, a very small number of them, but for the most part, it's all priests. Because the church was the organization that de facto was actually administering healthcare services and education services in Quebec. They were running the schools, they were running the hospitals, they were providing all of those pieces. And so it made sense to just have the minister be a priest or a nun to sort of represent the questions of what needed to happen in terms of health and education at the level of government. Okay, that is connected in a lot of ways to a really conservative kind of religious position. So there's a really common slogan from Quebec between sort of the coming forward to about the 1950s that goes l'enfer est rouge et le ciel est bleu. And for those of you who do not speak French, the translation of that is hell is red and the sky is blue. From a religious sort of perspective, that becomes, hell is red and the sky is blue. And if you connect that to the colors of, say, federal political parties, you have a pretty good idea of how the majority of the population of Quebec voted up until sort of the development of the Bloc Québécois, which changes a lot of things. And that's a slogan that you need to understand is not sort of just in the population in general. This is not just a population that sort of like generally believes in conservative politics. That's a slogan that you could go to church in Quebec and hear from the pulpit on Sunday morning because the priests were saying that sort of thing in church. You have really, really, really politically active priests who are essentially, using a slogan like that, telling their parishioners how to vote. So you need to understand what's going on in Quebec, sort of moving forward from that, is that there is that really, really, really close intertwining of church and state in Quebec at this point in time. This has some really interesting consequences. So we could talk about, again, if we wanted to dig into the sort of World War I history, you'd find that that's when women get the right to vote in federal elections. In 1916, if you had male relatives in active service, and in 1917 for everyone else. Um, and that's like the date that everyone talks about because almost all of the provinces in the country sort of followed suit in provincial elections. Quebec is the exception. Okay, so the federal right to vote is granted to women in Quebec in 1917, but they don't vote in provincial elections until 1944. And up until 1944, you're also talking about a number of gendered restrictions on rights. So until 1944, women in Quebec are not allowed to have a bank account, rent an apartment, sign a contract without their father or their husband's signatures. So there's some like really conservative gender ideas there about the place of women and sort of the roles that they can access in society. And connected to that, and like one of the reasons that sort of is connected to that, is something called La Vengeance du Berceau, which is translated to the Revenge of the Cradle. And this is, in a lot of ways, a strategy to avoid assimilation by the English. So we've talked a lot about attempts by the Anglophone population of Canada to sort of assimilate Quebec. And this is going to come out sounding like a joke, and in some ways it kind of is, but it is a very real strategy. There's sort of a commentary around if you want to avoid getting assimilated by the English, it's really easy to just outbreed them, right? Because there's this image of the English sort of being very, very stoic and not particularly passionate. Passionate is the polite word I can use in class on that one. So and the understanding was that if you just had more babies, right, that you would be able to preserve the Francophone culture and community because you have enough people. So when we're talking about La Vengeance du Berceau, the Revenge of the Cradle, this is a really explicit kind of government church blended support for larger families. So for those of you who have gone through Catholic catechism or Catholic marriage prep, you'll know that the church's position is officially that parents are supposed to accept as many children as God will grant. So, for example, my mother's family is Irish Catholic, and she is the oldest of 9. And that's really common in sort of very devout Catholic families, especially historically. Quebec is absolutely a part of that sort of tradition. But in Quebec, in particular, that gets married with sort of political and policy decisions, partially because of the overlap between church and state. So, for example, up in Quebec for a very, very, very long time, um, there would be sort of explicit policy sort of driven positions about what would happen when women sort of had large families. So for a really long time, if you had 10 children, then your youngest would get an education all the way through university on the dime of the state. So you'd be able to, like, even if you are a poor peasant farmer in sort of northern Quebec and are barely making ends meet, if you have 10 children, one of them can be a doctor and one of them can sort of do that kind of work. And that's an explicit policy of the sort of Quebec government for a really long time. We could talk about some contemporary echoes, and we'll get to that when we talk about sort of what Quebec looks like today. But the next thing that I need to say about that sort of experience and that sort of culture in Quebec is that it actually disappears really, 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 really quickly. So that's a very historical look at Quebec, and you can definitely see it represented in some Quebecois literature and film and stuff like that. But that's not contemporary Quebec at all. So there's a lot of unrest in the 1960s and from about 1960 through 1970 in Quebec, largely around linguistic tensions and the beginning of sort of an awareness of socioeconomic differences between Anglophones and Francophones in Quebec about who has money, who has power, all of that kind of stuff. It's set off by a particularly not so media savvy vice president of the president of CN Rail. And in 1962, the president of Canadian National Railways, which is headquartered in Montreal, or is at this point in time, was asked why none of CN's 17 vice presidents were Francophone. And he responded by saying that Francophones simply don't have the capacity to be in upper management. There's a lot of sort of demonstrations and upset in Quebec around this, and in some ways this is understood as one of the sort of defining moments of the beginning of the Quiet Revolution. So if you've never heard of the Quiet Revolution, La Révolution Tranquille, that's what we're talking about right now. And it is a doozy from us. As a sociologist, this is the kind of change that we almost never see. And so it's really, really important to understand what's happening here. So Jean Lesage becomes the premier of Quebec in 1960. He's getting rid of Maurice Duplessis. Maurice Duplessis is a Union Nationale premier who has been around for a real long time, and is really close to that sort of old boys club, chummy with the church kind of leadership in Quebec. And Jean Lesage takes over in 1960, as in Duplessis dies and Lesage wins the election. And Lesage starts making a lot of changes real fast. Real fast. So among those changes, he's reducing the role of the Catholic Church in the government of Quebec. So he develops a bureaucracy to manage public hospitals and public schools very quickly. He's reducing corruption in the Quebec government. So up until this point, like Duplessis is very much known for sort of contracts and sending people with baseball bats to convince people to vote certain ways. Like Duplessis is known for that kind of nepotism. And again, very quickly, Lesage is sort of working on that. He's implementing campaign finance laws. He's creating sort of regulations around spending on elections. He's requiring record keeping. He's doing all that kind of stuff. At the same time, he's also making massive changes to support labor organization and unions. So Duplessis is notably anti-union, anti-labor organization, and Lesage changes that position in Quebec very, very quickly. So the Quebec labor movement sort of gets this kickstart, okay? And all of that sounds really great to English Canada, because all of that sounds very much like, hey, Quebec's coming to join the party. They're not going to be our weird backwater cousins anymore. Sounds awesome until 1962. And in 1962, Jean Lesage's Liberals come out with a new slogan. That new slogan is Maître chez nous. And the best English translation of that is masters in our own house. And at that point, English Canada starts to get a little bit worried, because that sounds like Quebec trying to assert a degree of autonomy and a degree of control that a lot of people in English Canada didn't really think was appropriate. They don't really do anything about that, but that sort of, wait a second, definitely comes back later on in history. And this transition, this revolution, Jean Lesage's changes, work really, 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 really quickly. So in 1960, Quebec is the most religiously observant province in the country. There are the largest number of people who are attending regular services. There are the largest number of people who are baptized, who consider themselves to be practicing Catholics or practicing Christians. The number of people who think that the church should have a role in the government is highest. Really, really high in 1960. And it is the most secular province in Canada in 1970. So it secularizes really, 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 really fast. So there's lots of things in Quebec that sort of get upended in this point in time. So for example, in Quebec today, it's not allowed. It's a very difficult process. If you wish to sort of be a woman, get married, and change your last name to your husband's, there's a lot of ideas about that not being appropriate. But one of the things that I do sort of want to point out is that the religious nature changes, but the policy doesn't. So we talked a little bit about La Vengeance du Berceau, right? We talked about the Revenge of the Cradle. And in a lot of ways, there are still elements of Quebec's policy platforms that are connected to that same idea about supporting women having larger families, having more children. It's just not religious anymore. So contemporary examples of this include, for example, child benefit payments in Quebec that are slightly more generous than they are in the rest of the country, because the province provides a certain amount more money to families to be able to support and raise their children. And the really big one is the sort of universal daycare available in Quebec that is sort of priced at something like $7 a day. So it's way less expensive to send your kid to daycare in Quebec than it is elsewhere. Those pro-family policies stay, but the religious element shifts. That's la Révolution tranquille.